Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on race in America, an introduction. In this conversation, we are going to lay some foundational concepts for our future conversations. We are going to look at racism and develop a working definition of racism. We're going to look at the characteristics of a racialized society. We're going to ask ourselves whether we live in a racialized society or not. And then lastly, we're going to look at two opposing viewpoints on the question of whether or not we currently live in a racialized society. So by way of introduction into this conversation on race in America, we want to look at what does race look like in America today. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, about 76% of Americans identify as white. Within that group, there's about 18% that identify as Hispanic or Latino. There's about 13% of Americans who identify as black. About almost 6% of Americans identify as Asian. About 2 to 3% identify as two or more races. 1.3% identifies American Indian or Alaskan Native, and 0.2% identifies Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. So when we think about this, the first thing that's like really obvious about our racial makeup today is that each of these groups have vastly different experiences within the historical context of their race in America. Um, American Indians populated this land before any white people showed up. White people showed up, white Europeans showed up in the 1600s in what is our country today and began to subjugate American Indians, and over time placed them ultimately on reservations, which many of them still live on today. That is one experience. White Europeans who came here to America also decided to go to Africa and to bring Africans here to America for the purpose of enslaving them to exploit their labor. And that is a unique experience to Black Americans. So other groups would have other experiences. So what we want to focus on in this class is to look at race in America through the lens of the Black experience, because that is a really unique experience and an experience that has continued to be difficult for us to figure out how to handle appropriately. And so when we think of the Black experience in America, the important starting point is to understand the four basic eras of the Black experience. You have the slavery era, when slaves were first brought to Virginia in 1619, all the way up until 1865. You see how large that era is, two and a half centuries. 1865, we prohibited slavery in the United States at the end of the Civil War. And then that's followed by the Jim Crow era, the era of segregation and disfranchisement that lasted from 1865 until about 1954, when the Civil Rights Movement began, and a new era began for about 14 years, where Black Americans really began aggressively protesting for their basic civil rights in America, and where civil rights acts and voting rights acts and things like that were passed. That's about a 14-year period between 1954 and 1968. And then from 1968 to the present, there's what we call the post-civil rights era, and that's the era that we are living in today. It's about a 50-year period. And so as you look at the Black experience in America, you understand these eras. It's very important for us to understand the context of where we are at in the conversation of the Black experience in America. So obviously, the Black experience in America has been greatly influenced and affected by racism. And so that has been a serious problem in American history from the beginning for obvious reasons. It's a serious problem today. So I want to begin our conversation by asking this question: what is racism? I want you to pause for a second, and I want you to think about how would you define racism? It's a very interesting question. as you think through it, you probably would get many different answers if you ask people on the street, what is racism? So we want to try to come to terms with a working definition for racism. So in your view, take a moment and think, what is racism? Webster's dictionary defines racism as a belief that race is the fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. John Piper, a Baptist pastor, defined racism recently in an article like this. He said, racism is an explicit or implicit feeling or belief or practice that values one race over other races or devalues one race beneath other races. Beverly Daniel Tatum, in her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, defined racism as a system of oppression based on race. Racism can operate through impersonal systems and not simply through the malicious words and actions of individuals. And Michael Emerson, in his book Divided by Faith, defined racism as a changing ideology with the constant and rational purpose of perpetuating and justifying a social system that is racialized. So as we look at those four definitions and try to break them down, I think that we can draw out from them essentially two fundamental premises on which racism rests. The first premise is the idea that race is determinant of human traits and capacity, that race, the color of a person's skin, a physical characteristic, determines human traits and capacities. Something like race determines how honest a person would be, or the integrity of an individual, or the work ethic of an individual, the intellectual capacity of an individual's ability to learn tasks. Race determines human traits and capacity. That's the foundational premise of, of a definition of racism. The second premise flows out of that. If it is true that race determines human traits and capacities, then the racial differences that we see produce inherent racial superiority of a particular race. Then these capacities and traits determined by race, what they add up to is the idea that one race is superior to other races. And you might be confused by using the word superior because we normally think in terms of that we normally think of racism in terms of making another person or group inferior. But the truth is, the incentive here is not to make another group inferior. It is to elevate oneself, one's own group, and make one's own group superior. And so that is essentially the essence of racism, the idea that race is determinant of human traits and capacities, and that secondly, that the racial differences we see produce inherent racial superiority of a particular race. So how does racism manifest itself? How does this idea, these two premises on which racism is founded, how does racism manifest itself? How do we see it at work in the world around us? So there are basically two ways that racism can manifest itself. One is what we call interpersonal racism. This is when racism operates through personal beliefs, attitudes, and actions. Actions like racial jokes or slurs, discrimination towards a person or group, hating a person or group based on race, based on a physical characteristic, this idea of superiority. Now, it doesn't mean you don't have to hate the person to take a racist action, but it often becomes part of this conversation. I think John Piper's definition is helpful here. He says it's an explicit or implicit feeling or belief or practice that values one race over another. It can be just a feeling. It doesn't even have to be expressed. It can be a belief that you hold. You don't have to do anything, take any kind of action to be a racist. Or it can be a practice as well. It's all of these things um, together or separately that make up what we call interpersonal racism or person-to-person racism. The other way people say that racism can manifest itself is in systems, what we call systemic racism. This is the idea that racism can operate through impersonal systems to create a system of oppression based on race. Now, there's great debate in our society today as to whether or not systemic racism exists in the post-civil rights era. But the reality is, when we look at American history, systemic racism has existed. There was a system of slavery that oppressed people and exploited them for their labor, and it was racist. There was a system of segregation and disfranchisement that followed the end of slavery and lasted for about 100 years. And that was a system. And it was laws and it was practices and policies and ways of doing things that was embedded in the system. Today, some people would point to the idea that in our criminal justice system, there's some evidence that there's still systemic racism existing within our criminal justice system. Um, Black Americans and white Americans use and sell drugs at roughly the same rate, yet Black Americans are 6.5 times more likely to be incarcerated for using or selling drugs. People look at that statistic and they say that there most likely is some systemic racism within our criminal justice system. So, two basic ways racism can manifest itself: person to person, individual racism, interpersonal racism, and then secondly, systemic racism. So the next thing we want to look at is, how has racism adapted over time in America? Has it been a static concept? Have racists been arguing the same thing since 1619? Or does racism adapt over time? Michael Emerson says that racism is a changing ideology whose purpose is to perpetuate and justify social systems that are racialized. So from Emerson's perspective, as we look at the 4 different eras in American history, we can see that in the slavery era, racists argued that Black people are supposed to be slaves, that these traits and capacities that are determined by race determine that Black people are most well suited for being slaves. So that's the slavery era argument. During the era of segregation, where we created these two separate societies after slavery ended, we're no longer making that argument that Black people are supposed to be slaves. Instead, we're focusing more on the idea that Black people are intrinsically inferior to white people. Now, folks had made that argument before, but now it's being emphasized more at this time. And so that's going to be the underlying foundation for the idea of prohibiting racial mixing and having 2 separate societies. And then in the civil rights era, as Black people begin to protest and begin to argue that the system needs to be addressed, racism within the system needs to be addressed, and we need to guarantee equal rights, equal civil rights for Black Americans. Racists are going to start arguing that Black people must be patient and wait for change to come. So they might stop arguing uh, with regard to intrinsic inferiority so much and start saying, just be patient. Now, of course, there were people that weren't racist that were arguing that Black people should be patient during the civil rights era. But you could also see how somebody who wants to maintain the system, as Emerson said, a racialized system where one group has an advantage over another, could obviously argue for patience so that the system would be in place as long as possible. And then in the post-civil rights era, the argument shifts again, and people begin to argue that Black people must stop talking about the past, about slavery and segregation, and along with white people, embrace color blindness. Now, again, there could be many people who are not racist making the argument for color blindness. The idea that we don't see color anymore, we're not going to talk about it, that would actually be a wonderful thing if the system itself didn't have any systemic racial issues within it. But if it does, and you know it does, then this argument could be made by racists as well. And so racism has adapted over time in America to say different things at different times in order to perpetuate and justify a racialized social system. So Emerson brought up this term racialized society. We want to dive into that a little bit. What is a racialized society? The question for our period, for what we call the post-civil rights era, is what is our society like when it comes to race? Are we living in a colorblind society where race just doesn't matter anymore? The civil rights movement fixed all that. All those problems, and now we just live in a colorblind society? Or do we live in a racialized society, a society where race matters and it's part of who we are? So to help us understand what Emerson is talking about, we'll look at a quote from his book Divided by Faith, in which he said this: in the post-civil rights United States, the racialized society is one in which intermarriage rates are low, residential separation and socioeconomic inequality are the norm. Our definitions of personal identity and our choices of intimate associations reveal racial distinctiveness, and where we are never unaware of the race of a person with whom we interact. A racialized society is a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. So the real question here is, do we live in a society where race matters? Michael Emerson would say yes, race matters profoundly in the society that we live in now, in the post-civil rights era. Other people, again, would argue that that's not true, that we've moved on, that we've improved our circumstances, that we've made progress. Emerson is saying, yes, we made some progress, but we still live within a construct of a racialized society. So from that quote, I think we can draw out some basic characteristics of a racialized society. The first characteristic is that people identify themselves by race and are constantly aware of the race of others. Second characteristic, racial separation is normal and racial mixing is limited. Third characteristic, people encounter differing life experiences and opportunities based on their race. Fourth characteristic, racial inequality is the norm. The fifth characteristic, racially neutral actions can have the unintended result of contributing to racial division and inequality. So what that means is if we do live in a racialized society, then actions that are racially neutral actually can have the unintended result of maintaining the status quo of racial division and inequality. So again, the question I want you to think about is, as you look at these five characteristics, are these characteristics existent in our society today? Are some of them existent, some not, or some more obvious and less obvious? Are we living in a racialized society based on these characteristics? So in our current society, in our current conversations uh, in America, there are really two different answers being put forward to that question. Do we live in a racialized society? And they are rigidly opposing viewpoints on racism in America. You have critical race theory on one hand, making a particular argument, and then you have the opposing argument to critical race theory. A lot of conservative Christians and politically conservative people are making the opposition argument. A lot of liberal or progressive Christians or liberal or progressive thinking people politically are making the critical race theory argument. There's also a bunch of people in the middle that don't know what to make of this as well. So then, what is critical race theory? In its essence, it is an argument being made today, that race really does still matter in America, that we do still live in a racialized society, and that that's a problem. And so I will also say that it is being talked about very, very excessively in our culture. And as a result, and because it's become politicized, there is a lot of extremism and radicalism associated on both sides within the critical race theory viewpoint and in the opposition to the critical race theory viewpoint. So, what we want to try to understand is, what are these people actually saying? What is the core of critical race theory? And then understand the opposition to that. So to help us better understand the idea of critical race theory, one of the leading thinkers of critical race theory is a man named Derek Bell. This idea has been around for about 50 years. It's not new. It's being talked about much more now than before. But in one of his books, Derek Bell quoted Charles Lawrence, who wrote an article called "The Id, the Ego, and Equal Protection." And this is the quote that Derek Bell used to kind of frame what critical race theory is. And so he quoted Charles Lawrence saying, "Racism in America is much more complex than either the conscious conspiracy of a power elite or the simple delusion of a few ignorant bigots. It is a part of our common historical experience and therefore a part of our culture. It arises from the assumptions we have learned to make about the world, ourselves, and others, as well as from the patterns of our fundamental social activities." So I think we can use that quote that Bell uses from Charles Lawrence to create a basic definition of what critical race theory is about. Critical race theory is about the idea that racism is part of our common historical experience as Americans and therefore is deeply embedded in our thinking, culture, society, and institutions. And so critical race theorists are going to point to a long history of slavery and segregation and resistance to civil rights and to current things within our society. And they're going to say, this is not just a few bigots. It's not even a few people trying to create a system to manipulate other people or a group of people based on race. It is deeply embedded in the way we think, so much so that many people participate in things that are harmful to a particular race without even knowing that that is the effect of their action. That's really important to understand about critical race theory. Racism is our common historical experience, and it's deeply embedded in the way we think, our culture, our society, and our institutions. So critical race theory would argue five basic assumptions. The first is that racism is normal and ordinary. It's not an aberration to encounter racism in American society. It's normal. It's an ordinary part of life. It's expected. Secondly, racism is a social construct, a product of social thought and relations, and is embedded in United States social institutions. Therefore, individual racists need not exist for racism to be pervasive in the dominant culture. So racism is not just individual, it's a social construct, and it is embedded in US social institutions. And even if you eliminate the white supremacists out there, the people that are saying the hateful things and taking the actions, the racist actions, you would still have racism in America because it's built in to our systems. It's a social construct. Thirdly, racism is only removed from social structures when the interests of the dominant group converge with those of the marginalized. This is what's called interest convergence theory. The idea is that the dominant group never removes racism from social structures unless it benefits them. So an example would be Democrats, so white Democrats favoring voting rights for Black Americans. And we, through the lens of interest convergence, critical race theorists would say the only reason white Democrats would do that is because they know that the vast majority of Black Americans who vote will vote for Democrats. And so there's an interest convergence there. Fourth, racism intersects with other aspects of a person's social identity, class, gender, etc., to create different modes of discrimination. And so this is what's called intersectionality. And the idea is that, so if you're an immigrant, you come from Mexico to America with your children, you're a woman, you're a single mom, you bring your children across the border, you speak a different language, you're a person of color, you come from a different background, you're an immigrant. Critical race theory says that racism intersects with other aspects of a person's social identity. So if you're poor, if you're female, all of these things would work together to create what we call intersectionality. And that is that you can experience marginalization on multiple levels based on the different parts of your social identity. The fifth assumption of critical race theory is the idea that racism is something uniquely understood by those who experience it, and this knowledge must be shared with others through storytelling. And so this idea is the idea that those who experience racism understand it in ways that no one else understands. The people that don't experience it don't understand. And so it's extremely important for those who experience racism to share the knowledge of their experience with others through what's called storytelling. That this is an important mechanism for our society to get better, to recognize the problems that exist, and to improve. So those are the 5 basic assumptions of critical race theory. And again, in general, it's a lens by which we can use to look at American institutions to try to understand the relationship of racism within our institutions. So I said it's a very controversial theory. The opposing view of critical race theory would say that racism is not normal, that it's rare, and that we're making lots of progress and our society is far better now than it was 50 years ago. The opposing view would say racism is not a social construct, it's not embedded in institutions, it is the action of individual people. The opposing view would say interest convergence theory suggests that the motivation of white people is always bad and that they never act in the interest of other people. This is a big part of the opposing view, the idea that critical race theory is excessively negative towards white people, tries to make all white people racist, tries to ignore the fact that white people can rise above the culture that they live in and the racism that exists around them, and to take an action that is in somebody else's interest and not their own. The opposing view says that intersectionality creates a victim mentality that's unhealthy. If we're constantly looking for all the ways we are marginalized, we are going to develop a victim mentality, and that's unhealthy, and it kind of goes against concepts of individualism and self-reliance and independence and things like that. And then lastly, the opposing view says that storytelling emphasizes the value of subjective knowledge, the idea that some people know better than others with regard to race. It suggests that there is no objective or absolute knowledge on issues of race and gives preference to the views of one race over another. So that's the opposing view. That's where many people in our society call critical race theory into question. So in this conversation on race in America, we have tried to introduce the concept of race in America. And we tried to create a framework by way of introduction for future conversations on race in America. And so we've looked at racism. We've developed a working definition of racism, that race is determinant, based on 2 premises, that race is determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce inherent racial superiority of a particular race. We've looked at how racism manifests itself both interpersonally and systemically, and we have looked at how racism has adapted over time in America. And then we looked at the characteristics of a racialized society, and we asked ourselves, um, do we live in a racialized society in the post-civil rights era? And then we looked at two opposing viewpoints uh, that answer that question. The critical race theorists who would say, yes, we definitely live in a racialized society, and those who oppose critical race theory and would say essentially the opposite of what critical race theory says, that we don't live in a racialized society anymore, that in the post-civil rights era, we've made tremendous progress, and that we have moved forward and are continuing to move forward from these issues. So some questions to consider from our conversation. First of all, what is racism? What is your definition of racism? What is your understanding of racism? Secondly, do we live in a racialized society? Why or why not? Look at those characteristics. See which ones are valid and which are not. Do we live in a racialized society? And then thirdly, what are the strengths and weaknesses of critical race theory from a Christian perspective? I want you to think through the assumptions of critical race theory, the underpinning idea, and then also the opposition idea to that. And I want you to think, what's the strengths and weaknesses of critical race theory? What parts are useful? What parts are not useful? Or is anything in it useful? How do we handle this conversation? And again, I want you to think of it through the lens of a Christian perspective.